8 months away. 8 brutal months overseas, every night dreaming of home. My bed, the familiar gravel road, and Grandpa's water tower standing proud for 60 years. It watched me grow up, held every family memory in its shadow. I pull in, sunburned and exhausted, heart pounding with relief. Then, gut punch. Nothing. Just a cold gray concrete slab. The tower? Erased. Gone like it never existed. No warning, no call, nothing. Only a laminated sign smack in the middle. Structure failed code compliance. Demolished per section 4.7. Thank you for your cooperation. Cooperation? I was halfway around the damn world. They waited till I left, then hit me hard, thinking I'd just take it lying down. Huge mistake. I know how to wait too. And when I was done waiting, everything changed forever. What would you do in my shoes? Where are you watching from? And has an HOA ever screwed you like this? Like if you want the full revenge. It's insane. Let me back up, because you need to understand what that water tower meant before you can understand what happened next. My name is Garrett Thorne, third-generation landowner in Elkhorn County, Colorado, which, if you've never been, is the kind of place where your neighbor waves when you pass on the road, and you can smell pine sap and red clay baking in the afternoon heat. My grandfather, Eldon Thorne, built that water tower in 1961. Hand-welded steel tank on a timber frame, painted barn red, sitting on the back edge of the property like a guardian. It fed the irrigation lines, kept the fire suppression tanks topped off, and in a pinch, kept the house running when the municipal line had pressure drops in August. It was infrastructure. It was history. My grandfather built it the same summer he built the house. He used to say the tower and the house were the same project. One kept the family sheltered, one kept the family alive. I grew up watching him touch up the paint every spring, moving slow on a ladder, but never once complaining. When he passed, it passed to my father. When my father passed, it passed to me. I'd been deployed, civilian contractor work, not military, though I'm a veteran, working infrastructure assessment for an international relief organization in East Africa. 8 months of bad roads, worse internet, and the kind of heat that makes Colorado summers feel like a spa. I had limited contact home. I checked in on the property through my neighbor, a retired electrician named Walt Duvall, who drove by twice a week and texted me updates. Walt's texts usually said things like, "Grass is long," or "Deer on the east fence again." Good man, terrible photographer. Now, Elkhorn County had been quiet for decades. Nice little unincorporated community. Folks minded their business. Nobody needed a homeowners association. That changed about 4 years before I left, when a developer named Prescott Hargrove bought up 6 adjacent lots, built a cookie-cutter subdivision he called Ridgecrest Commons, and then, with absolutely no irony, started an HOA to govern the surrounding older properties too, by bundling a community integration clause into the county rezoning paperwork that nobody read carefully enough, including me. That was my mistake. I'll own it. The HOA's president was a woman named Claudette Voss, retired pharmaceutical sales manager, newly elected to the county planning committee, and possessing the kind of confidence that only comes from having never been told no in a professional setting. Claudette had opinions about everything: fencing heights, mailbox colors, gravel composition on driveways. Yes, you read that right. She sent a citation about gravel type. She had taken a particular interest in my property because it sat on the highest ridge in the neighborhood and was, according to her exact words at a planning meeting 2 years prior, aesthetically inconsistent with the Ridgecrest vision. The water tower had been on her list for a while. 6 weeks before I left for Africa, I'd received a letter. One letter, no follow-up, suggesting the tower was potentially non-compliant with a new aesthetic ordinance the HOA had passed at a meeting I wasn't notified about. I wrote back, certified mail, stating clearly that the structure predated any HOA authority, was registered as a historical use agricultural fixture with the county, and that I did not consent to any inspection or modification. I left for the job. I trusted the paperwork. And while I was testing water filtration systems in the Rift Valley, Claudette Voss hired a demolition crew, got a rubber stamp from a compliant county inspector she'd been having lunch with for 2 years, and turned 80 years of my family's history into a flat slab of concrete. The rage I felt when I saw that slab? It was cold, focused, patient, the worst kind. The first thing I did, and I'm proud of this because my instinct was to put my fist through something, was take photographs. Every inch of that slab. The edges where the timber posts had been cut off below grade. The rebar they'd poured over the old anchor bolts. The faint rectangle of darker soil around the perimeter where the structure had blocked sun and rain for 6 decades. I took photos of the laminated sign. I photographed the date stamp on the demolition permit taped to my own fence. Then I called Walt. Walt Duvall answered on the second ring, and when I asked him what he saw, he went quiet for a long moment. "Garrett," he said, "I drove by Tuesday. It was there Tuesday." His voice had that particular flatness of a man who is furious, but too old and too practical to let it run hot. "They came Wednesday morning, had it down by noon. I called the county and they said it was permitted. In 3 days, start to finish." I thanked Walt, hung up, and sat on the concrete steps of my porch while the afternoon sun hit the back of my neck like a brand. The smell of sage and warm earth came off the hillside, the way it always does in late September in Elkhorn. Sweet and dry, and a little bit like something ending, which felt appropriate. The second call I made was to a property rights attorney in Denver named Renata Solis. I'd used her once before on a fence line dispute, and I knew she was the kind of lawyer who got quietly, methodically angry on behalf of her clients. I described what happened. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "Okay, first question. Do you have the original survey, the county registration for the agricultural fixture, and your certified mail receipt?" "Yes, yes, and yes." Then they just made a very expensive mistake. Here's the first legal beat the audience should know. Under Colorado property law, and similar statutes exist in most states, an HOA cannot demolish a pre-existing, legally registered structure without providing written notice, a formal hearing opportunity, and a minimum 30-day cure period. Claudette's team had sent one letter, received one certified mail rebuttal, and then acted unilaterally. That's not code enforcement. That's trespass and destruction of property. Takeaway: one letter is not legal process. Know the cure period requirement in your state. But here's what made it more interesting. Renata dug into the county filing on the demolition permit, and it had been issued by a deputy inspector named Fowler, who had approved the job in under 48 hours, which was, by county statute, physically impossible for a legitimate structural demolition permit. The standard review period was 10 business days. Fowler had signed off in 2. So we had HOA overreach, destruction of a registered structure, and a permit that may have been fraudulently expedited. I could have filed a lawsuit right then. Renata suggested I wait. "Let them think they won," she said. "Let Claudette send you the bill." "The bill?" "She's going to bill you for the demolition cost. They always do. It's in the fine print of the Community Integration Clause. Non-compliant structure removal costs may be assessed to the property owner. She's going to send you an invoice for about $6,000. I laughed. First time I'd laughed in 2 days. Letter. The invoice arrived 11 days later. Printed on HOA letterhead with a little Ridgecrest Commons logo in the corner. A stylized ridgeline that looked, I noticed, nothing like the actual ridge outside my window. The invoice was for $6,200. It included a line item for structural remediation and another for community aesthetic restoration. There was a cover letter from Claudette herself, signed in blue ink, that said, and I am quoting verbatim here, "We hope this closes the matter and allows us all to move forward as a community." I made a copy. Renata made a copy. I framed the original. That document was going to matter later. Then I went to the county assessor's office and pulled every document associated with the Ridgecrest Commons development. All public record, all technically boring, and absolutely loaded with landmines. Here's what I found in 2 hours of file pulling. Prescott Hargrove's original development had been approved contingent on maintaining a shared stormwater retention agreement with the older properties on the ridge, including mine. That agreement meant Ridgecrest Commons drainage permit was tied to my land, specifically to the area where the water tower used to stand. The demolition had removed the registered anchor point for the shared drainage easement, which meant Ridgecrest Commons stormwater permit was now technically out of compliance. I drove home with a stack of photocopies and the particular smell of old county office paper, that dry, slightly chemical scent of documents that had been waiting to be read for years. Some papers are patient. They wait for the right moment. This was going to be a good moment. Claudette's next move came faster than I expected, which told me she was nervous. 2 weeks after the invoice, she appeared at a county planning committee meeting, the same committee she'd recently joined, and proposed a motion to reclassify the Ridgeline properties, including mine, as part of the Ridgecrest Commons Aesthetic Governance Zone. If passed, this would give the HOA direct zoning authority over any future structures I wanted to build, including replacing the water tower. It would also, conveniently, make challenging the demolition significantly more complicated, because any new structure would require HOA pre-approval. She was trying to close the trap before I could get back inside it. The meeting was on a Tuesday evening. I sat in the third row and watched her present it. She wore a blazer the color of a surgical scrub, and spoke in the calm, slightly bored tone of someone who expects every room to agree with her. She had a PowerPoint. There were before and after photo simulations of what the ridge would look like, unified under consistent standards. My property, in her simulation, had been replaced with a tasteful brown fence and a gravel pad. She hadn't noticed me in the audience yet. When the floor opened for public comment, I stood up. I introduced myself. I thanked the committee for their time. I then placed on the record that the property in question was currently the subject of an active legal consultation regarding the unauthorized demolition of a registered agricultural structure, which I said carefully and specifically, so the clerk would record every word. I noted that any rezoning action taken while that legal matter was pending could constitute an attempt to circumvent due process, and that I would be providing the committee with a formal objection letter within 72 hours. You could hear the air conditioning hum. Claudette's jaw tightened by about 2 millimeters. I noticed because I was watching. The committee chair, a tired-looking man named Alderman Beck, who clearly wanted to be home watching football, tabled the motion pending receipt of my objection letter. Claudette collected her papers with the precise, controlled movements of someone who is extremely angry and has excellent posture. On my way out, she caught up with me in the parking lot. The gravel crunched under our feet. The air smelled like pine resin and cold asphalt, that particular October night smell that means winter is thinking about showing up. She stood close enough that I could see the small American flag pin on her lapel, the kind of prop that certain kinds of people use to suggest patriotism as a personality trait. "Garrett," she said, smiling, "I didn't know you were back." "I'm back," I said. "I hope you understand we were just trying to maintain community standards." "I understand completely," I said. "I'll see you at the hearing." The objection letter Renata filed was 14 pages long and included 3 exhibits. It formally documented the lack of due process in the demolition, introduced the stormwater easement issue as a related matter, and, this was Renata's particular touch, filed a concurrent complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Board, which in Colorado has real teeth. Here's the second legal beat. Most states have HOA oversight boards or ombudsman offices that receive formal complaints. Filing with them creates an official record and often triggers mandatory mediation, which forces the HOA to respond on the record, which means every overreach is documented. Takeaway: a state HOA complaint costs nothing to file and creates leverage you can use in court. Claudette's response to the oversight board was filed by her own attorney, a local real estate lawyer named Sheridan Price, who, I would later discover, had also served as the notary on 2 of Hargrove's original development documents. Small town, very small town. Their argument was straightforward. The structure was non-compliant. The HOA acted within its authority under the Community Integration Clause, and Garrett Thorne had been given notice. They submitted the single letter as their evidence of proper notification. 1 letter. That was their whole case. Meanwhile, Walt Duvall had been quietly doing me a favor. A retired electrician with too much time and a genuine grudge, because he'd also received a citation for his tool shed 2 months prior. Walt had started attending every HOA board meeting and recording them on his phone. Not secretly. He sat in the front row with his phone face up on the table and told anyone who asked that he was keeping his own records. Claudette hated it. She'd tried to ban personal recording devices, but the HOA's own bylaws didn't support it. Those recordings were going to matter. But first, I had to find out what was in Ridgecrest Commons water. Not metaphorically, literally. Here's something most people don't know about private HOA subdivisions built quickly on former agricultural land. The developer is responsible for the initial infrastructure hookup, including water service, and that hookup has to be certified by a licensed plumber and approved by the county utilities board. It's boring paperwork. It almost never gets scrutinized. Almost. I'd been pulling documents for 3 weeks by this point. My dining room table had become a paper archaeology project. County permits, drainage filings, utility certificates, HOA board minutes. The smell of printer toner had replaced the smell of dinner. I was eating sandwiches standing over my kitchen sink and going to bed with the particular low-grade headache that comes from reading small print under bad light. And then, on a Tuesday night at about 11 o'clock, I found it. When Hargrove built Ridgecrest Commons, he had tied the subdivision's water service into a shared lateral line, a pipe that ran through my property as part of the original county easement. This was standard practice for ridgeline development. The main service line ran along my property's western boundary. Hargrove had gotten permission for this, in writing, as part of the county easement agreement. But that easement had a term. It was a 20-year agreement, renewable by mutual consent of both property owners. It had been signed in 2003. It expired in 2023. Nobody had renewed it. Not Hargrove, who, I learned from a brief search, had sold his interest in Ridgecrest Commons to a property management company called Pinnacle Ridge Holdings 2 years earlier. Not Claudette's HOA board. Not the county utilities office, which had simply continued the service without checking the underlying easement. The shared water lateral serving 64 homes in Ridgecrest Commons ran through my property on an expired easement. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. The house was quiet, except for the refrigerator hum and the sound of wind picking up outside. A loose shutter knocked once, twice. I want to be clear about something. I am not a vindictive person by nature. I am a practical person. I believe in proportionate responses, and I believe that the law exists for a reason. I did not, at this moment, decide to shut off anyone's water. I decided to consult my attorney and understand exactly what my rights were. What Renata told me, after she stopped laughing, was this. A property owner has no obligation to allow a utility easement to continue operating on their land after the easement has legally expired. The county had been running a utility through my property without a valid legal right for 2 years. The proper remedy was to notify the county, notify Pinnacle Ridge Holdings, and allow a reasonable period for remediation, which, under Colorado utility law, typically meant the easement holder had 90 days to either renegotiate or reroute. Here's the third legal beat. An expired utility easement is a real legal vulnerability. If a utility, water, gas, electrical, runs through your property on an easement that has lapsed, you have legal standing to demand renegotiation. This is especially common with older rural to suburban conversions where paperwork was sloppy. Takeaway: pull your property's easement history. Expired easements are more common than you'd think. I did not send the notice yet. I filed it with my attorney and we held it, because something else happened that week that changed my timeline. Walt texted me a recording. At the most recent HOA board meeting, which I hadn't attended because I'd been elbow deep in county archives, Claudette had made a comment during the closed session that Walt had captured on his phone through the open door. She hadn't realized the door hadn't fully latched. In the recording, Claudette's voice was clear and flat. Thorne is going to push back on the demolition. That's fine. Let him spend money on a lawyer. We've already moved the money from the reserve fund into the beautification account, so if he gets a judgment, there's nothing liquid to collect against. She had moved HOA reserve funds, money that belonged to every homeowner in Ridgecrest Commons, to make the HOA judgment-proof against my potential lawsuit. That was fraud. Not rhetorical fraud, not moral fraud. Actual financial fraud against her own neighbors. I called Renata at 7 in the morning. She answered like she'd been awake for hours. I heard, she said. Walt had sent her the recording too. How do we play this? Very carefully, she said, and very publicly. There's a moment in every one of these situations where the balance of power shifts, not dramatically, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a lock turning. This was that moment. We now had the original demolition as trespass and destruction, the fraudulently expedited permit, the HOA's insufficient notice, the stormwater easement disruption, the expired water lateral easement, and Claudette on tape committing financial fraud against her own homeowners. But Renata had found one more thing, and this one was almost elegant in its simplicity. When Prescott Hargrove had written the community integration clause, the clause that supposedly gave the HOA authority over my property, he had included a standard reciprocity provision. This is common in HOA documents. The provision says that the rules apply equally to all governed parties, including the developer and the HOA board itself, meaning the same aesthetic and structural standards Claudette had used to demolish my water tower applied to every structure in Ridgecrest Commons, including the Ridgecrest Commons Community Clubhouse, which had been built with a rooftop mechanical unit, an HVAC system, that was visible from the road and exceeded the maximum height for external equipment under Section 4.7, the same section she'd used against me. Section 4.7 worked both ways. She used her own weapon against herself, I said. She handed it to you, Renata corrected. Here's why this mattered beyond the poetic justice. It demonstrated selective enforcement, which is an explicit violation of HOA fiduciary duty. An HOA board cannot selectively apply its own rules, enforcing them against homeowners it dislikes, while ignoring violations by its own properties. Selective enforcement is a recognized legal defense against HOA enforcement actions in most states, and in Colorado, demonstrated selective enforcement can invalidate the enforcement action entirely, meaning the demolition order, predicated on Section 4.7, was potentially void, because Section 4.7 had never been uniformly enforced. We now had 6 distinct legal and financial vulnerabilities in Claudette's position. 6. Any one of them would have been enough for a settlement conversation. Together, they were enough to fundamentally change the power structure of this entire community. But there was a human dimension to this that I hadn't expected. When word got out, and in a community of 64 homes plus a dozen ridgeline properties, word gets out fast. I started getting calls, not from Claudette's supporters, from her own homeowners. 3 of them came to my house on a Thursday evening. A couple named the Farnsworths, who'd been in Ridgecrest Commons since the beginning, and a retired nurse named Bertie Oakes, who had lived next to Walt for 12 years. They sat at my dining room table, the one still covered in documents, and told me about their own citations, their own letters, their own fear of Claudette's retaliation. She changed the dues structure without a vote, Bertie said. Her hands were wrapped around a coffee mug, and she spoke quietly, like someone used to being careful. We've all been paying 20% more for 2 years, and nobody's seen a budget breakdown. That reserve fund Claudette had shifted, it wasn't just my problem, it was everyone's money. I looked at the 3 of them around my table, and understood that this had become something bigger than my water tower. This was about 64 households who had been living under a one-woman financial dictatorship, afraid to speak because they didn't know they had any power. They had power. They just needed a plan. The next 3 weeks were the best kind of busy, the kind where everything you're doing has a purpose, and the purpose has a shape. Renata and I met twice a week, in person, at her Denver office, which smelled perpetually of strong coffee and slightly anxious clients. We built what she called the layered response, a sequence of actions that would hit Claudette's position from multiple directions simultaneously, so she couldn't triage fast enough. Legal, financial, regulatory, and structural. Each piece timed, each piece documented. Let me walk you through it the way we built it, because the architecture matters. The first layer was the easement notice. Renata drafted a formal notice to the County Utilities Board and to Pinnacle Ridge Holdings, the management company that had replaced Hargrove, informing them that the water lateral easement crossing my property had expired in 2023 and had not been renewed. Under Colorado law, this triggered a mandatory 90-day remediation window. During those 90 days, the easement was legally in a contested status, which meant any changes to the infrastructure were suspended pending resolution. The county couldn't simply renew it without my consent. Pinnacle Ridge couldn't reroute it without permits, and I was under no obligation to grant renewed access while my separate legal claims against the HOA were unresolved. This did not shut off anyone's water. Let me be absolutely clear about that. The water kept flowing, but it now flowed under a legal cloud, and that cloud cost money. Every day the easement was in contested status, Pinnacle Ridge was accumulating liability exposure. Their insurance would know. Their lenders would know. That was the point. The second layer was the financial fraud complaint. Walt's recording, combined with the HOA's own financial filings, which Renata had obtained through a state HOA records request, another free tool that most homeowners don't know about, showed a clear pattern. Dues had been raised without a homeowner vote, reserve funds had been redirected, and at least 2 expenditures had been paid to a vendor with a business address that matched Claudette's sister's home address. That last one was the kind of detail that makes a state investigator sit up straight. Renata filed the complaint with the Colorado Division of Real Estate, which oversees HOA conduct. She copied the state attorney general's office. She also sent a quiet note to the HOA's own liability insurance carrier, because insurance companies do not like fraud, and they really do not like being on the hook for a board that commits it. The third layer was the homeowners. Bertie Oakes, who turned out to be a former county board member and knew exactly how community organizing worked, started making calls. Quietly, coffee conversations, evening visits. By the end of the second week, she had commitments from 38 of the 64 Ridgecrest homeowners to attend an emergency HOA meeting. And under the HOA's own bylaws, 35 homeowner signatures were enough to force one. They forced it. They scheduled it for a Saturday morning, 6 weeks out. The fourth layer, and this is the one that required the most physical work, was the documentation of the clubhouse HVAC violation. I hired a licensed surveyor to measure the rooftop unit's height relative to grade. The surveyor produced a sealed document showing the unit exceeded Section 4.7's equipment height limit by 4 feet and 2 inches. I also hired a structural historian. They're more affordable than they sound, especially if you know a university architecture department, who produced a 2-page assessment confirming my water tower's status as a pre-HOA, county-registered agricultural structure that predated any aesthetic governance authority. 2 professional reports, sealed, admissible. The fifth layer was the press, not the big press, local press. The Elkhorn County Courier, which was a weekly paper with about 4,000 subscribers, and a reporter named Vic Aldana, who had been covering county government for 18 years and had a genuine nose for petty institutional corruption. I called Vic. I gave him nothing except the public records, the demolition permit, the easement expiration, the HOA financials, all public documents, and suggested he might find them interesting. He found them very interesting. "You're not the first person who's called me about Claudette Voss," Vic said. I figured. "But you're the first one with this much paper." I told him the HOA meeting date, told him it might be worth attending. 6 weeks, 5 layers, every piece in place. I drove home that evening through the pass, windows down, the smell of diesel from a cattle truck ahead of me, mixing with cold pine air, and I felt, for the first time since I'd come home to that concrete slab, something I can only describe as the calm before a very well-planned storm. Claudette was not sitting still. She'd heard about the easement notice. Small town, remember? And her response was to do what people like her always do when the walls start closing in. She went on offense. First, she sent a letter to every homeowner in Ridgecrest Commons. 3 pages, single-spaced, on official HOA letterhead. The letter described me as a non-cooperative property owner engaged in a campaign of intimidation against our community. It said I was attempting to hold the community's water supply hostage for personal financial gain. It was, word for word, projection. She was describing exactly what she was doing to me. It also, crucially, mentioned the legal action I had pending, which meant she'd been paying attention to Renata's filings, which meant she was scared. Walt forwarded me the letter with a 1-line text. "She's flailing." She was. But flailing people are dangerous people, and I knew better than to get comfortable. Her second move was to approach Deputy Inspector Fowler, the man who'd fast-tracked the demolition permit, and apparently suggest that he file an amended report that clarified his review timeline, meaning she wanted him to falsify the date on a county permit to make the 2-day approval look more legitimate. Fowler, to his credit, didn't do it. What he did do was call the county council's office and ask whether he had any exposure. The county council, apparently alarmed, called Renata, who was already their counterpart on the easement matter, and this is how we found out that Fowler was quietly cooperating. Sometimes the people Claudette thought were her allies were just people who were afraid of her. and fear is not loyalty. Her third move was the one that made me genuinely angry, because it was personal in a way the others hadn't been. She filed a formal complaint with the county health department, claiming that my property, specifically the area where the water tower had stood, was a potential contamination risk and should be inspected before any new structures were built. The implication being that my grandfather's old water tower had been leaking or harboring something hazardous. There was no evidence of this. It was entirely fabricated. The health inspector who showed up, a young woman named Paulette, who wore her official jacket like it was a Halloween costume, and looked genuinely embarrassed to be there, took soil samples, filed her report in 2 weeks, and found exactly nothing. Clean soil, no contamination, no hazard. But the inspection cost me 3 weeks of delay on the replacement structure I'd been planning, and it had forced me to pull the historical survey and the structural documentation again and submit it to yet another county office. Time, money, and aggravation, which was exactly what Claudette intended. I added the complaint, the inspection report, and the clean bill of soil health to the file. Here's what Claudette didn't understand about her own escalation. Every move she made produced a document. Every document went into the file. Every item in the file was another piece of a pattern. And patterns, in law, matter more than individual incidents. 1 overreach is a mistake. 5 overreaches, each escalating, each following a complaint from the same homeowner, that's a course of conduct. That's harassment. That's the kind of thing that turns a civil suit into a punitive damages conversation. Renata was keeping track, quietly. Meanwhile, Bertie Oakes had been having the kind of neighborhood conversations that Claudette couldn't see coming because she'd never thought of her neighbors as independent adults with their own grievances. Bertie was methodical. She visited each home personally, brought her own printout of the HOA's financial records, and walked through the numbers line by line. The dues increase with no vote, the vendor payment to the address matching Claudette's sister, the reserve fund transfer. I watched people's faces change, Bertie told me later. They'd come in thinking this was your fight. They left understanding it was theirs. By the time the emergency meeting was 2 weeks out, Bertie had 47 commitments, 47 out of 64 homeowners. That's not an opposition faction, that's a supermajority. And Claudette still didn't know the scale of what was coming, because she'd spent so long treating her neighbors as subjects rather than stakeholders, that she'd lost the ability to read the room. The last week before the meeting, I drove past Ridgecrest Commons on my way home. The late autumn light was flat and cold, the kind that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. The clubhouse sat at the entrance to the subdivision, its rooftop HVAC unit silhouetted against the sky, 4 feet and 2 inches too tall. It had been there for years, visible to everyone. Nobody had ever pushed back, until now. The week before the meeting, Claudette made her most desperate move. She called an emergency board session, not the homeowner meeting Bertie had forced, but a separate board-only meeting, and attempted to pass a resolution that would, essentially, preemptively bar any homeowner from raising pending litigation matters at the upcoming meeting. She wanted to gag the agenda before it happened. Her board had 3 members, herself, a man named Doyle who managed a car dealership and had been going along with everything because he didn't want conflict, and a woman named Prue who had joined the board to help with landscaping decisions and had been deeply uncomfortable for about 18 months. Prue voted against the gag resolution. Doyle, faced with a tie vote and the sudden awareness that he was sitting next to someone who had been recorded committing financial fraud, also voted against it. The resolution failed. Prue called Bertie that evening. She wanted to know if it was too late to cooperate. It was not too late. Claudette's next maneuver was to try to have the meeting date changed. The HOA bylaws allowed the board to reschedule a called meeting once, for logistical reasons, by a majority vote. She called a second emergency board session to vote on the reschedule. Doyle and Prue didn't show up. Without a quorum, the vote couldn't happen. The meeting stayed on the calendar. This is the part of these stories that people underestimate. The moment when the villain's own infrastructure starts to collapse. Claudette hadn't built loyalty, she'd built compliance. And compliance, when fear fades, evaporates. She was discovering that her board, her county contact, and her neighbors were not allies. They were people who had been quietly waiting for someone to make it safe to stop going along. We had made it safe. Meanwhile, my crew was working. My crew being, in this case, Walt Duvall and his nephew Cody, who was a licensed plumber. I want to be very precise about what they did and didn't do, because the internet will misread this if I'm not careful. They did not tamper with any infrastructure. What they did do was install a new surface water monitoring station on my property, a perfectly legal piece of equipment that measures flow, pressure, and composition in the water running through the lateral on my land. Fully permitted, fully above board. The monitoring station also, incidentally, allowed Renata to provide real-time data to the County Utilities Board about the flow volume through the expired easement. It was not a shut-off valve, it was a spotlight. The County Utilities Board, now fully aware that they had been running service through an expired easement for 2 years, was in a quiet panic. They had two options: negotiate a new easement with me, or begin the process of rerouting the lateral, which would take 6 months and cost somewhere in the range of $200,000 of county and developer money. Neither option was fast. Both options required my cooperation. Renata scheduled a pre-meeting conversation with the county utilities director for the Monday before the Saturday HOA meeting. In that conversation, we made clear that we were prepared to negotiate a fair, properly compensated easement renewal, and that our cooperation was contingent on the county's acknowledgement of the improper demolition and its consequences for the stormwater easement. The utilities director, a practical man who had not been part of any of Claudette's maneuvers and was simply trying to keep water flowing to 64 households, understood the situation immediately. "What do you need?" he asked. What we needed was a letter, a formal county letter acknowledging that the demolition permit had been issued without proper review time, that the stormwater easement had been disrupted as a result, and that the county was initiating a review of Deputy Inspector Fowler's approval process. Nothing extreme, just the truth in writing on county letterhead. He had it drafted by Wednesday. Thursday night, I sat at my dining room table, finally cleared of most of the papers, which had been organized into binders, and went through everything one more time. Legal, documented. Financial, documented. Structural, documented. Community support, 47 households. Press. Vic Aldana had confirmed he'd be at the meeting. County, cooperating. I thought about my grandfather painting the water tower every spring, moving slow on the ladder. The way the barn-red paint looked against the pale blue of a Colorado morning. The weight of 60 years of something mattering. I was not going to get the tower back. That moment was gone. But what happened next Saturday was going to matter. For me, for Bertie, for 47 families who'd been paying for something they'd never seen a budget for. For Walt, who'd driven by twice a week for 8 months. For Prue, who voted no when it cost her something. Saturday morning, community room in the Ridgecrest Commons clubhouse, directly underneath a rooftop HVAC unit that was 4 feet and 2 inches too tall. The meeting was called for 9 a.m. By 8:40, the community room was full. 61 of 64 homeowners showed up. 3 were out of town. Every single person who could be there was there. People stood along the walls. Someone had brought folding chairs from their garage. The room smelled like coffee from a percolator someone had plugged into the corner outlet, and the low murmur of 60 people in a space built for 30 filled the air like the sound before something breaks. Claudette arrived at 8:55. She walked in with her HOA binder and her American flag pin, and the particular bearing of someone who has not yet understood that the room has already turned. She took her seat at the board table. Doyle sat 2 chairs away from her, slightly angled, the body language of a man who wants to be associated with the furniture more than the person next to him. Prue sat at the far end, hands folded. I sat in the second row, next to Walt and Bertie. Beryl Daldana from the Courier was in the back row with a notepad. He'd also brought a photographer. Claudette called the meeting to order. Bertie stood up immediately with a point of order. Under the HOA bylaws, a homeowner called meeting required the agenda to be set by the calling parties, not the board. She presented the agenda, which she had typed, printed, and distributed at the door. Item 1, financial review. Item 2, board conduct. Item 3, structural enforcement history. Item 4, board recall vote. The room was quiet. Claudette said, very carefully, "Mrs. Oakes, I'm not sure this agenda is in order." Section 12, paragraph 3 of the bylaws, Bertie said, still standing, still calm. Homeowner called meetings. The agenda is in order. Alderman Beck, who had been invited as a county liaison observer, nodded slowly from his seat near the window. What followed was the most orderly demolition I have ever witnessed. First, the financial report. Bertie walked through the HOA financials line by line. The dues increase with no vote, documented. The reserve fund transfer, documented. The vendor payments to the address matching Claudette's sister, documented, with the business registration showing the connection. 3 homeowners who'd had no idea said, out loud, "She paid her sister?" The word moved through the room like a current. Second, the board conduct section. Renata, who I had invited to attend as my legal representative, which under HOA bylaws was a permitted role, presented the State Oversight Board complaint and its current status, active investigation, mandatory mediation ordered. She presented the county letter, which she read aloud in full. The demolition permit had been issued without proper review time. The county was initiating a review of the approval process. Claudette interrupted twice. Both times, Bertie invoked bylaws. Both times, she was correct. Then came the structural section. The sealed surveyor's report on the clubhouse HVAC unit. 4 feet, 2 inches above the Section 4.7 limit. The same section used to justify demolishing my grandfather's water tower. Renata stated it plainly. The enforcement had been selective, which, under Colorado HOA law, rendered the enforcement action against my property legally void. The room, by this point, was making a sound I can only describe as the collective exhale of 60 people who have been holding their breath for a long time. Claudette stood up. Her voice, for the first time in any context I had observed, was not quite controlled. "This is a coordinated attack on this community. This is a bylaw meeting," Bertie said. "Please sit down." The recall vote was the last item. Under the HOA bylaws, a 2/3 majority of present homeowners could recall any board member. The vote was conducted by paper ballot, counted by 3 volunteer homeowners in front of the room. Judette Voss was recalled by a vote of 54-7. She stood up, collected her binder, straightened her jacket, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at the room. 60 people who had been her subjects for 4 years, who were no longer afraid of her. And then she left. The room exhaled again, longer this time. Walt leaned over and said, quietly, "Your grandfather would have liked this. I think he would have." Vic Aldana was already writing. The photographer had gotten every moment, including Claudette's exit. The story ran the following Thursday, front page, above the fold. The headline, and Vic had a gift for headlines, was H.O. A president recalled after residents learn cost of community standards. It was, by a significant margin, the most read story in the Elkhorn County Courier's online history. Here is what happened in the 6 months after that Saturday morning. The county completed its review of Deputy Inspector Fowler's approval process and found 3 other permits he had expedited improperly over a 4-year period, all connected to Hargrove-adjacent development projects. Fowler resigned. 2 of the 3 projects are under re-review. Claudette Voss did not face criminal charges for the reserve fund transfer. The amount was just below the threshold that triggers felony prosecution, but the state's Division of Real Estate levied a $14,000 fine against the HOA and required a full, independent financial audit. The audit found that homeowners had been overcharged by an aggregate of $31,000 over 2 years. That money was refunded. Every household in Ridgecrest Commons got a check. Renata filed my civil suit for the demolition. 4 months later, Pinnacle Ridge Holdings, which, as the successor entity to Hargrove's development, had inherited the liability, settled for $85,000. That covered the tower's assessed replacement value, my legal fees, and a portion of documented agricultural revenue loss. The settlement included a formal acknowledgement that the demolition had been unauthorized. I used part of the settlement to hire Walt's nephew Cody and a structural engineer to design a new water tower. It went up in March. Not barn red. I painted it the color of the sky at about 7 in the morning, a pale silver blue that my grandfather used to call Colorado morning. Cody said it was an unusual color for a water tower. I told him it was exactly the right color. The HOA easement was renegotiated at fair market value. I received a proper annual compensation for the lateral crossing my land, which I had never received before. The new easement has a clear renewal schedule and a mutual consent requirement. It is, as these things should be, a real agreement between real parties. Prue became the interim HOA president. She hired an independent accountant, instituted a homeowner vote for any dues change, and posted the monthly financials on a shared community board outside the clubhouse. Doyle stepped down but stayed on as a volunteer, mostly to manage the parking lot. He was, it turned out, fine at parking lots. Bertie Oakes used her organizing momentum to start something that I think is the best thing to come out of all of this. She proposed, and the new HOA voted unanimously to fund, the Elkhorn Ridge Community Scholarship. One scholarship per year, $2,500, for a graduating senior from the local high school who demonstrates interest in environmental stewardship or community service. The first recipient was a girl from the Valley who was going to study environmental engineering. I attended the presentation. It was held in the community room of the Ridgecrest Commons clubhouse, under the repaired ceiling and next to the HVAC unit, which had been brought into compliance 2 months prior. Bertie made a short speech. She talked about community as a verb, not a noun. She talked about what it means to show up for your neighbors. She did not mention Claudette. Walt cried a little. He'd deny it if you asked him. I thought about my grandfather again, and about the water tower, and about how some things that get destroyed leave a better shape behind them. The flat slab is still there. I haven't covered it yet. I'm thinking about what to do with it. Maybe a garden, maybe a bench, something that people can sit on and look out at the ridge. Something that says, we were here, we stayed, and we built something worth keeping. If you've ever had a Claudette in your life, an HOA bully, a petty authority figure who treated your home like a problem to be managed, I want you to know that the paperwork matters, the community matters, and patience is the most powerful tool you have. Pull your easements. Know your HOA's bylaws better than they do. File the complaints. Build the file.
Here's what I keep coming back to. Not the $85,000 check, not the 54-7 vote, not even the county investigation that took down a deputy inspector who'd been rubber stamping permits for 4 years. What I keep coming back to is Bertie Oakes, a retired nurse, 60-something, who showed up at Garrett's door with 2 neighbors and a coffee mug and said, she changed the dues without a vote. We didn't know we could fight back. They didn't know. That's the whole story, right there. Colette didn't just demolish a water tower. She ran a one-woman financial operation over 64 households for 4 years, raising dues without a vote, redirecting reserve funds, paying vendors with her sister's business address because she was counting on every single one of those neighbors, not knowing they had any power. Garrett knew, and then he made sure everyone else does too. By the end, it wasn't his fight anymore. 47 families showed up at that Saturday morning, 61 out of 64. People brought their own folding chairs. That's not a legal victory, that's a community that remembered what it was supposed to be. The Elkhorn Ridge Scholarship, first recipient is studying environmental engineering, started by a retired nurse who got angry enough to make phone calls. That's what happens when one person decides to read the paperwork. So let me tell you, and let me ask you this question. Do you know what's in your HOA documents right now? Because somewhere in there is either your protection or your vulnerability. Usually both. Drop your story in the comments, subscribe. Next ones are already waiting. They came for one man's tower. They woke up an entire neighborhood.